to the New Churches podcast. My name is Noah Oldham, and today I'm joined by Matt Carter, Vance Pitman, and Mark Lee. We've been working through the 9 essentials for a faithful and effective church planter, the Send Network's 9 essentials we use for really everything that we do with church planting. And the first 8 of them have been very theological. We come to this one now, and we're talking very practical. Practical leadership is our last essential. And so just from the get-go, there's a reason we call these essentials, because practical leadership is essential. It cannot be overlooked. I'd love to start with you, Mark. What do we mean by practical leadership in church planting?
Yeah, I think there's just so much that seminary can't teach you. There's just so much, even in the Bible, that it doesn't address specifically certain topics. Like very early on in my church planting journey, I was like, okay, the guy down the street, he's got the same Bible that I do. He's got the same Holy Spirit that I do. And so why is he experiencing so much more momentum than I am? And so there's so much like, how do I get into my first building? I don't know how to do. They didn't teach me how to do stuff like, how do I hire and fire staff members? I mean, those can be deal breakers or deal makers, within the church planting realm. So I think this is huge.
Yeah. Noah, the reality is leadership matters. Like it always has, and it always will. The Bible is full of examples of the effect of both good and bad leadership. And some of the things when you talk about leadership, obviously there are biblical principles that can govern and guide our leadership, but there are a lot of principles of leadership that aren't necessarily biblical or non-biblical. They're just practical leadership issues. And we're not saying by this, just go do whatever you want to do, whatever works. These are practical leadership principles that are obviously governed by and under the authority of, and in submission to Scripture, but they're just practical, everyday leadership principles that all of us as leaders have to live out.
Yeah, what I've noticed so much with church planting residencies is a lot of guys come to a residency and they're godly and they're theologically trained, but they have no experience starting something like a church. They don't understand the organizational structure that comes along with it. I was one of those guys that I thought I should pass this assessment with flying colors, and they're like, but you've never started anything like this. You need to learn the nuts and bolts. And we see when guys do that, man, they're a lot more successful. So one of the first areas of practical leadership we see from the get-go that is, I think, touches every area of church planting. Before you launch, at launch, and beyond launch is vision casting. It's one of those areas that causes some pastors to lean in and others to kind of roll their eyes. What should we mean by vision casting, and why does that matter? Matt, how would you say to that?
Yeah, so looking back at my ministry over the years, my time as a lead pastor, I don't think it's possible to overestimate the importance of vision. I used to be one of those guys that kind of poo-pooed it down and rolled my eyes, and but looking back on it, it was crucial. And I think Travis Ogle, who works with us here at Send Network, he said something one time describing vision casting that really gives a great mental picture for us. And he said, man, as a church, as a people, you always need a mountain to climb together. And I think that's a great picture of what you do as a leader. Is you are painting a picture of what we're doing together. It's a movement forward together. It's a goal that you get to, and then you inspire people to do it. I think it's crucial in leadership. And the times of my ministry where I wasn't casting vision well, you just didn't see that momentum. The inverse was true when I was casting vision well.
I think it's important as we have this conversation that we really clarify what we mean when we say vision. I think everything that Matt said is 100% true. We need to, what is that mountain we're going to climb? Where are we going together? But the definition that I've been using for vision in the last decade or so is, as I've led in Las Vegas and now leading at Send Network, spiritual vision is allowing people to see the activity of God and then inviting them to get in on it.
That's good.
Spiritual vision is not me coming up with a dream and asking God to bless it. And in the arena of church planting, we've all seen this. You get this prospectus from this planter who's dreamed up this dream, like, here's what the name's going to be, here's how many campuses we're going to have, here's how many people we're going to have, and it's this dream, and now it's like, okay, God, make this a reality, versus starting in a posture of hearing from the Father. What is it that He's doing? And when you allow people to see the activity of God and you invite them to get in on it, people will leverage their lives for the sake of God's activity. I said this in another one of the episodes of this season, but in the book of Ecclesiastes, it says that He's put eternity on the heart of human beings. And we don't know all that means, but I think part of what it means is there's something woven into the fabric of being a human being that you long to be a part of that which is eternal. And Psalm says it's only the counsel of the Lord and His plan that's from generation to generation. My plan won't outlive this generation, but His will. And when we see what He's doing and we invite people to get in on it, they'll leverage everything they have for the sake of that which He's doing.
And I think there are almost two different activities when we talk about vision casting, because there's the vision creation, and not necessarily that I'm creating the vision, but I'm tapping into this God-given vision of what could be and what should be. But if you think about vision casting, I think that's different than having a vision. Because vision casting, I think, is a fishing term. Because here's what I'm doing. I'm taking the dream that God's given me, and I'm going to cast it out to see if anybody's biting. And I think that's the invitation element that you're talking about. I think there are a lot of great church planters that are great visionaries. I don't know too many that lack vision. I know a lot of church planters that are great communicators, and they're really good at, just dreamscaping for everybody else.
Yeah, that's really good.
But to actually get them to bite, and to get them to give money and to give their time for the only thing that will matter in all of eternity, that's a different skill that I feel like, especially when you're an associate pastor, maybe you lack that skill a little bit more that God really wants to hone and refine by the time you become a planter.
I want to dig deep into that a little bit because I think, as I said, vision casting is essential, one of the most essential things in church planting. You need it to raise money. You needed to gather a core team. You needed to compel non-believers to come check out and hear the gospel. You need it in so many levels. I think, to your point, Mark, what is so compelling that causes people to bite often is how we form the vision. Vance, I'd love for you to speak to that. You talk about the differentiation, how people look at sometimes vision, they think Old Testament, but you have a process for vision, New Testament, I think brings people along and they're quicker to bite. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, what you see often in the Old Testament is one person going up on the mountain, hearing from God, coming down from the mountain and telling people what God has said. The New Testament paradigm is very different than that. It's plurality. In the New Testament, people often heard God together. You see that the apostles, the disciples, the early church, in Acts 13, the leaders of the church at Antioch, they're hearing God together. And there's a collective ownership of having heard God in community. And it's one of the things that I think is damaging to the church in North America today, because we often have this idea the pastor's supposed to go up on the mountain and hear from God, and then the pastor comes down and tells the people, here's where we're going. When often what I saw at Hope in over 2 decades in Vegas, often God spoke to the church through the church. Some of the best visionary leadership ideas we had didn't come out of my office. They came out of conversation with brothers and sisters in our fellowship where God was birthing these things. And then as a community, we discerned the voice of God together. And then the beauty in that is then everybody owns it. I don't have to sell it as much as I'm communicating what everybody's understood to be God having spoke to us as a fellowship. Now, that doesn't mean that vision casting is not important. That still has to be communicated. It has to be done in a compelling way, a clear way, where people can own that, understand it, and buy in. But I think the difference in Old Testament and New Testament as it pertains to vision is this idea of hearing God together and doing that in community and inviting other people into the process.
So good.
Now, there's something Vance said there about that I think is crucial. It's the body of Christ hearing God together. So now, in the New Testament today, how do we hear from the Lord? We hear from the Lord through His Word. And I think when I look back on the times that we were casting vision as a team, as I was casting vision as a pastor, the most successful visions we got were biblical. Something that we could tie from the Word, has the vision from the Word of God. And then it's not just you coming up with an idea, but it's you're saying, thus says the Lord, let's jump into what God's already doing.
That's right. Well, as a part of the process that you mentioned, Travis, a moment ago, who's our executive vice president with Send Network, he was my executive pastor in Las Vegas for over a decade. He built a strategic planning process that annually we would lead our entire team through. It started with 4 to 6 weeks of just the Word and prayer. Just the teams coming around the Word, coming together in prayer, because a lot of the dramatic stuff that took place in the New Testament happened in moments of the church being together in prayer. Like, they weren't in a whiteboard session deciding how to carry out the Great Commission when they sent out Paul and Barnabas. They were worshiping and praying, and the Spirit of God impressed them in that moment. This is what's supposed to happen. So I think that's a key part of that process.
So good. Vision casting, so important. Now, moving on to another part of practical leadership. In hermeneutics, we say that context is king. And in planting, context may not be king, but it really does matter, having a contextual fit. How can a planter discern if he's a good cultural fit for where he wants to plant? And how would you answer objections to contextual fit? Mark, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm looking for in a church planter is a guy who's going to leave his past behind him and really embrace the area that he's going to, that he's got to love the city that he's going to. So I'm looking for a church planter who's willing to change his zip code, his area code on his phone, first of all. I'm looking for him to change allegiances of his football teams.
Hold on now, brother. Wait a minute.
I want him to love the area that he's living in. And, there are guys who can come in and, I know that, Vance, you love Alabama football. But you love the Las Vegas Knights. You came into an area and you probably held on to Alabama football just because Las Vegas, I don't mean to offend you, but probably didn't have a huge college football team, right? And so even guys like Will Browning have come from the South even to work more in a Send Network role in California. So here's what I'm trying to say, that I think those are surface level things. When we talk about football teams, when we talk about area code, all those, I think that's important, but they're surface levelly, because you got a guy like Will Browning who comes in as the SCM in Los Angeles, and he is embraced by the people of Los Angeles. Do you know why? He still has an accent. He doesn't look like LA. He doesn't feel like LA. But at the same time, he's just so genuine. He's so transparent. He's so authentic, and you can tell that he embraces his people, and because of that, the people love him. So are wearing a football jersey, is that important? Yes.
Yeah, it is.
But it's not as important as the people knowing that you're not just going to hide in your office and write sermons all day long because you really love the Word more than you love exegeting your own people. I want to see you like out in Starbucks, loving the people, like being out with everybody else.
That's good. Yeah, Vance, a lot of times people go through an assessment and church planters are like, I don't know if I could ever plant there because I don't look like it, never been there, I have a lot of experience. I love hearing your story about a guy from Alabama who planted with a team from the South in Las Vegas. Just share briefly about how context matters, but how you can overcome context.
So, when we moved to Vegas 25 plus years ago, when the church that sent us out there, First Baptist Woodstock, was approached about a planting team, they told them, you need a planter who's from the West, who's over 35, and who's planted a church before. So I was 28 years old. I'd never traveled west of the Mississippi River. And I'd never even been a part of a church that had planted a church, much less planted a church myself. So there were a lot of things that contextually screamed, this is not the best fit. But we'd heard clearly from the Lord. We knew God had called us. Our sending church had discerned and affirmed that call. They sent us out. But I think some of the things Mark said was so true. Like, we knew God had not called us to the dream of a church. He'd called us to a mission in a city.
That's it.
And because we loved the city of Las Vegas, like, I don't know that over the last 20 years there's another person in Las Vegas who's personally recruited more people to just live in Las Vegas than I have, whether they connected in our church or not. Like, I was a travel agent for the city. I was selling the city. I wore the jerseys. Like, I still have season tickets to the Knights games, and I live in Atlanta now. But you talk Alabama football, but I'm as big of a UNLV Rebel fan. Like, I love everything Las Vegas. I love that city. And it was more than a changing of an area code. It was everything about you just fell in love with the city, and you embraced that city. And I never stopped being from Alabama. My accent was a dead giveaway every time I met anybody. The first two questions people would ask me in Vegas were, where are you from and what are you doing here? But it opened the door to so many gospel conversations. But there has to be a willingness to die to where you're from as you make that transition. I couldn't go to Vegas and plant an Alabama church. Right. I had to see a church born that was contextualized to the city of Las Vegas, because that city needed the expression of the gospel in its own city.
That's really good.
I would add this. I mean, you're looking at two guys right here from the South that planted in definitely more urban, liberal cities. I'm not a contextual fit for Austin. If I had been assessed by our current Send Network planters, they would probably, give me a yellow light and say, man, you probably shouldn't go to Austin. I'm an Aggie. There's a long-term rivalry there. I'm from East Texas, kind of lean conservatively, conservative, and it's a very liberal city. But here's something that I found as I pastored the Austin Stone. Because you said it, Mark, you got to be authentic. Yeah. The thing that I kept hearing from folks in Austin is myself and a group of University of Texas college students planted that church, is like, Matt, we know you're a redneck, we know you're country, but you're just who you are. Yeah. I think where I would have gotten in trouble is if I went into Austin and tried to look like Austin, when everybody knows I don't look like Austin.
Yeah, totally.
And so they respected me for the authenticity.
That's really good.
Like when Brian Kelly showed up in LSU and tried to talk with a Southern accent. This guy that had never lived in the South, and he shows up day one, tries to talk with a Southern accent. It just, there's an air of inauthentic about that just comes across. And same thing for me in Vegas. Everybody knew I was from Alabama, but they also knew that if you ask anybody in Vegas, does Vance Pitman love Las Vegas? Yeah. There ain't no doubt about it. The love affair that my family had with that city, and what God was doing in that city. And so it's the authenticity of being who you are, but understanding that God brought you there. And I'll be honest, in my personal experience, Las Vegas did as much to change and transform my family as my family did in changing and transforming Las Vegas.
And even to that point, I would say this, that you may be a perfect contextual fit for your city as a church planter, but if your wife doesn't want to live there, I don't think you should go there.
That's a good word.
Yeah. Because, this is what we know about spouses, that if the spouse is unhappy, then your lifespan in that city is just going to be limited. In ministry, period. And so I think there are a lot of church planners who are just so gung-ho about this vision that God has put on their heart. They fall in love with maybe the opportunity of building a large church because they see in that area that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. Man, there's so much opportunity there. Honey, we could go there and we could really thrive. And what he means by that may be that we can build a large church. Yeah. We can get a steady paycheck. But if she hates that area, man, that is not the area for you.
Yeah, I think because this is practical leadership, not pragmatic leadership, a lot of times guys are thinking, where can I go and have the biggest bang, biggest splash? But to Vance's point, church planting is not only for what's going to happen outside of you, it's what's going to happen inside of you. I grew up a lifelong hater of the city of St. Louis. I was a Cubs fan, born in Chicago, grew up with that huge rivalry. My mom was sick most of my life. I'd go to St. Louis to go to the doctor, and so I hated the city. And God called me to plant. I wanted any city but St. Louis. And I always told the joke, I didn't want to end up in the bottom of the Mississippi in the belly of a catfish, and so I went. And I thought, well, I'll be in the suburbs. And God called me to plant right down in the urban core. Wow. And it was only his call, and God did something in me through those years. To where now, I'm an apologist for the city. Love the city and give historic tours of the city. Yep. And I think through that, God changed more about me than he even did the city through that process. That's so good. All right, next, another huge area.
Before you move past it, Noah, I will say this. One of the things I love about what we do at Send Network is that our assessments are in region, and we encourage planters to be assessed in the region where they're going to plant, because there's something about, if you're trying to answer the question, am I contextually a good fit for this city?
Yep.
You can't answer that question by yourself. The Proverbs principle is to seek counsel and input from others to make wise decisions. And so in seeking counsel with your sending church, but also trying to make sure you get assessed in the region where you're going to plant by others who have experience in that region, I think is a major part of discerning that decision.
That's huge. That's huge. And they can help you in the areas you're deficient for your growth. Yeah. Another practical area of practical leadership is fundraising. It's one that is necessary for church planting. Whether you have to raise money for a salary if you're vocational, or you're raising money and bringing partners along for the work that God is doing in your church, it is a non-ignorable part of planting. How would you encourage planters to faithfully and effectively raise money for the mission of planting? Matt, let's start with you, man. What's your experience in this?
Yeah, so when I was the same age as Vance when I planted the Austin Stone. I was 28 years old. And man, that was just something I had never done before. I'd built teams, I'd preached, I'd led different, had a lot of experience as a student pastor. I never raised money. And so I just kind of jumped in with both feet and did a lot of things wrong, did a few things right. Here's what I learned, and this is just very practical. Vance is going to say something more profound, but it's just very practical. I learned that when I would go to other churches and ask for money, sometimes they'd give me a one-time check. But very, very rarely did just a guy walk in the door, even if I had relationships with a pastor and receive funding from churches. A lot of times they have a budget. That budget's used. It's already allotted. There's not typically in churches hundreds of thousands of dollars laying around that's not budgeted. Where I had the most success was with personal friendships, businessmen, families, and I would be very honest with them. I would email them, call them, say, hey, man, I've got something I want to talk to you about. I'm starting a church. I want to see if you'd be interested in being involved with it. They 9 out of 10 times say yes. Go to lunch with them. Cast a compelling vision based in Scripture, since we've heard from the Lord. Man, this is what God's doing. This is what the opportunities are. Would you consider being a part of that? And man, I'll never forget, as long as I live. This is back in 2001. And me and my planter guy that I went with named Brad Cawley were in this business guy's house, and we're just sharing the heart of going into Austin, and we're making some tears come out, casting vision for Jesus and what we're gonna do. And man, this guy pulls out a checkbook. They used to use checks back then.
Oh yeah.
And I'll never forget it. He wrote a $100,000 check and handed it to us, and then the real tears came because that moment hit us. Man, we're gonna be able to feed our families for a year or so. But man, and let me say this last thing, I'll shut up. Like, there are people out there that have money and that are looking for opportunities to be a part of what God is doing. Don't be afraid to invite them into it.
Yeah,
That's good.
Yeah, just a few practical things to go along with what Matt said. And this idea of raising funds, I think you need to first of all think about having a kingdom vision cast.
That's good.
And by that, I mean, nobody's interested in helping you build your empire, but they are interested in helping you expand God's kingdom.
That's right.
And if you're just talking about planting a church, but if you're talking about a multiplication of churches with a heart for the nations,
Whole city,
now you're casting a kingdom vision. So at Hope, for years as a church, we would never invest in a church planter who cast a vision to us to plant a church.
That's so good.
If it was a church that was going to multiply, plant other churches, that's where we wanted to get involved, because that was a kingdom vision. And so we want to be a part of a kingdom vision.
That's compelling, because it's a spiritual return on investment, man.
Well, and anything that is of the Lord is going to be about multiplication. And so that to me is a key component in developing the relationships that are going to turn into funds. And I think that's the second thing I'd say is, don't focus on raising funds, focus on raising friends.
That's good.
And if you build the relationships and cast the kingdom vision, the money will follow. Money follows vision, and it wants to be a part of that. So I think I would focus there and do that through stories. Telling stories is a compelling way to allow people to see what God's doing and invite them to get in on it. So those are some practical things.
Those are helpful.
There's so much hesitation in raising funds because a lot of times a church planter has never had to do that before. They were just given a budget from the senior pastor and it just felt like manna from heaven. And I think one of the Here's what I realized during the church planting process. That as I was raising funds, what God was doing is God was cutting my teeth on vision casting, really.
Yes.
This skill that I'd never honed in
Yep.
on in the past. And I would raise money and manpower for the rest of my ministry. That is not something that's going to happen just during the planting process. That's going to happen all throughout my ministry. And here's what I've realized. If I can't do it now, then I won't be able to do it then. And so this is where I think, fundraising is all about relationships.
It is.
That's part of the reason why we get celebrities to endorse products.
Yeah.
Why does Michael Jordan represent Fruit of the Loom underwear? It's because we believe in the person before we believe in the vision.
That's so good.
And so we might be able to meet with another pastor and go, I got a compelling vision. Oh, yeah? Who cares?
Who are you?
Who are you to think that you might be able to pull off something like that? So this is what I tell church planters, that there's a happy medium between asking for funds too early and never asking for funds and
that's
just expecting God to just provide to provide the money. And so never ask for anything on a first date. This is what I instruct church planters with, because that's almost like asking a girl to marry you on the first date. What you really want to do is there are other resources that you might be able to mine into that are going to help you, even if the pastor doesn't give you any money. And that's his wisdom, his friendship. So begin to cultivate that relationship. And then after about 3 or 4 times, maybe God will open a door at that point. But don't ask for it too early. You're going to scare him off. But also don't never ask for money too.
And from the kingdom standpoint, the other thing that I think planters have to be reminded of is we're not asking people to give something away. We're asking them to make an investment that is going to return for them in eternity. If it's a church, it's going to bring blessing and favor into that fellowship. If it's an individual, it's going to bring blessing and favor into that individual and into their family in this generation and in generations to come. The Bible is not a give to get mentality, but there's also a biblical principle that you can't outgive the Father. When we seek first his kingdom, he takes care of us. So you're asking them not to just give something away, you're asking them to make an investment in the only thing that is going to yield return for them for all eternity. And if we honestly knew we were sitting on a business that was going to reap millions of dollars into somebody's life, we wouldn't hesitate to ask them to invest if we knew the return was guaranteed. This is a guaranteed return.
That's right.
And it's not just a return that's here. It's a return for all eternity, and we're asking them to get on that. So get in on that. So I think that's a
preach.
Don't you wish you'd have called him like 20 years ago when you're planting the church? Like, Vance, tell me what to say. Hey,
I love Matt. He just always makes me feel
Hey,
good.
let me say one more thing too, because I used to be scared to death to preach on money. I was scared to do it. And because inevitably when you preach on it, people are going to get upset, man. When you start poking at people's gods, they're going to get mad at you, and money is a lot of folks' gods. But I think it's important. Jesus talked about money all the time. It has the power to own our hearts like nothing else. And I think that they need to teach. Don't be smart. Don't do it all the time. But even in moments like Vance, during every single Sunday, you talked about this on another podcast. Every single Sunday, during their time of giving, they would have a teaching moment. And in that moment, they tied it to kingdom vision. They're like, we're a church. You're not giving to a church, you're giving through a church. And so constantly using the pulpit announcements to cast kingdom vision for what money is doing.
Well, and I'll say this just directly to any planter that's listening or watching this right now. You will never have freedom and authority in raising funds and teaching people generosity if you don't live generously. If this is not the practice and pattern of your own life, you'll never be able to do what we're talking about right now. This is something that has to be done out of the overflow. It's one thing to stand up and talk to people about generosity. It's as a paid salesman. It's something else to do it as a satisfied customer. When you've lived a generous life, I never was ashamed to talk about this in our church, because I would say with honesty, if you want to come look at my checkbook, I'll show you. I'll show you that this is not something I'm telling you. This is something my family's living. And as a planter, you'll never be able to live in the freedom and the authority of this principle if you're not living this principle out in your own life.
And I would encourage them to tithe from day one. Be generous from day one. Trust God in that. at the very beginning of your church when you're poor as you can be, and then you
Yep.
can stand up and talk about the faithfulness
right.
of God when it's time to preach it.
Yeah. Well, there's a book that I like to recommend to church planters. It's a book by Bill Dillon called People Raising. A lot of times we talk about fundraising. It's raising people.
It's raising friends.
He says
Yep.
the last point of this process he lines out is you want it to envision a jersey that they put on that's got your last name on it. And just a practical story about that. We had a young couple that I knew. I grew up with the gal in Sunday school. We were the rivals in the sword drills. I wasn't even a Christian, but I was going to beat her at sword drills in Sunday school, but she often beat me. So there's this rivalry. When God called me to plant a church, she was at my home church. She heard the vision, and her and her brand new husband, who hadn't even met me at the time, began to give $100 a month. They gave $100 a month for 11 years. Through all kinds of stuff in their own life. So finally I had to call them and say, I'm not raising money anymore. Like, you can give to something else. Like, we believe in what God's doing through your life. We want to give. That's the power of people raising. I had people that were millionaires that gave one time and it's done. But people that are with you will be with you no matter what.
And can I make one comment to what it is that you're saying? Just because somebody's made a commitment doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to keep their commitment.
That's right.
And so I think it's so important for a church planter not only be able to initiate that relationship, but to maintain that relationship. Because what that church planter doesn't know is that senior pastor, that missions pastor, that person has a million other church planters also coming to them going, hey, support me, support me, support me. And out of sight, out of mind. You might blame the sending church, or you might blame the partnering church for not fulfilling their commitment, but did you maintain that relationship?
That's great.
Such a good word.
Yes.
On this vein, let me give our planters that are listening one little golden nugget. This is the golden nugget of fundraising for church planters. We would raise about $20,000 to $30,000 a summer just doing this. Almost every church in America is going to have Vacation Bible School. And every Vacation Bible School is going to have the penny drive between the boys and the girls to take a mission offering, and they're going to give that offering away at the end of that week. You can get 20, 30, 40 churches that give you their VBS offering, and you can raise $20,000 or $30,000 this summer, and it's easy. Most of them are looking for a place to give that money, and when they're able to stand in front of boys and girls and say, for every dollar you give, we'll put the gospel in a household in Vegas. Man, that just resonates, and it's an easy way to raise money. So go find you some churches doing VBS offerings and raise some funds.
And can I say one more thing to that effect?
You better.
I think one of the things that's super important for church planters to be able to discern is if they get a no, is that a no or is that a not now? Yeah, because money just isn't lying around. But are you telling me no because you don't want to support me, or do I just have to wait until it's my turn? So if I get a no, or if my church planter gets a no, I'll always tell them to ask, okay, well, can I get on your next round? Or do you have a year-end offering coming up? Would I be able to get on your year-end offering? So that's another couple ways to be able to discern that.
That's really good. You know, you mentioned this earlier, Mark. You said there's just some things that seminary doesn't teach you about practical leadership. I would love to give you guys each a moment to think about that, because I want to offer some of those things. What are some of those areas of practical leadership that a sending church can help their residents, their church planters develop before they're sent out that maybe they don't learn in seminary? And as you're thinking of that, I'll give you one practical example. For us, it was communication skills, not preaching. Seminary will teach you how to preach if you take a homiletics class, but so many guys get up and begin to preach and they are boring. Now, what's worse than going and meeting at a rented space you have to set up and tear down, and things are a little bit dirty and dimly lit, and your kids feel like they're in a weird spot, is then sitting for an hour and listening to a guy be boring. And so we would teach in our part of our preaching lab the practical skill of communication, and we would do it by not preaching. What we'd do is we'd have them tell a compelling story, and then we do a thing called gospel fluency drills. So you got to get up and just tell a compelling story. We also tell our young men it's training to be a grandpa. You learn to tell stories. But then we would take a box full of objects and throw them out on the floor. And starting with the oldest Christian, who'd been the Christian the longest, they grab an object, and they have to take this object and within 30 seconds get to the gospel. 2 practical ways to teach them to be able to communicate with the room quickly or also tell a compelling story. What are some things you guys have found that seminary doesn't teach you, but planters need for practical leadership?
The first one that pops into my head is managing people. Seminary doesn't teach you anything about managing people. And when you plant, it starts managing volunteers, But then you go from managing volunteers to maybe a small 1 or 2 person staff, and then as that staff, if it grows, I know at the end for me at Hope, we had over 100 people on our team, on our staff team. So you start small, but then it winds up growing at times to significant levels. But it's all about managing people. And if you're not careful, when you get to church planting, if all you've done is seminary, you've never been in an environment where you've been taught and trained how to manage people. And the Bible has stuff to say about this. Yeah. Like, for example, Proverbs has a proverb. It's one of my favorite proverbs. It's a business proverb. It says, where there are no oxen, the manger is clean. But much increase comes by the strength of the ox. Yep. So here's what that proverb says. If there are no cows in the barn, there's no crap to shovel. But if there are no cows in the barn, there's nothing being produced in the field.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So the question you always have to ask as a manager is, what I'm shoveling worth what's being produced in the field?
Yeah, that's good.
And when I'm having to shovel more than's being produced, it's time to make a decision about that person that I'm managing. Yeah. But some people require a big shovel, but it's worth a big shovel.
That's right.
Because of what's... So managing people is about evaluating those things, and people have to be taught how to manage people.
Really good. What else? You guys got something?
Just kind of adding on to that is leadership. We talked a little bit about it at the beginning of the podcast. I was one of these guys that when I was a youth pastor early in ministry, erroneously I just thought, man, all I need is the Bible. Just the Bible and Jesus, and that's all I ever need. Well, once you plant a church, I mean, it is a church, but at the end of the day, there's so many business aspects to it. Mm-hmm. And so, I would say this. I would say number one is be honest with yourself about what you're weak at.
Yeah.
Be honest with yourself about what you don't know. Yep. And then don't be afraid to ask the Lord and find and develop relationships with people that are good in those areas, bring them onto your team, and then trust them to lead in that area. I don't know, what would y'all add to that?
Yeah, I would say that the Bible can teach you knowledge, but only life can teach you discernment. And so I think what we want to be able to do is add to that level of knowledge, so that I think one of the difficulties in ministry is this discerning ability to know, is this a cold or is this cancer? So what I don't want to do is I don't want to overreact to a situation where I treat a cold like it's cancer, nor do I want to underreact to a situation and just kind of sweep it under the rug, which is what a lot of churches can do as well, because we're just very positive environments in general. We just want to see the best in things. And so I think, believe it or not, this idea of discernment and helping a young person, because I think a young person, especially a church planter, their child is just so fragile that I think they lose perspective. And I think one of the things that we can teach them to do is just kind of calm down and ask slower, clarifying questions in order to discern the nature of the problem and the severity of the issue. Really and so I think that's super important for a young person, because they always live in fear and they can overreact or underreact.
Another, I think, part of the thing a sending church can help their planters being sent out is in the area of just financial systems.
Yeah.
It's another thing you don't really learn in seminary. So what we would do at Hope is we would invite our planters into our what we call our stewardship team meetings, that we would allow them to sit in some of those to experience how we made financial decisions. And then once our planters were sent out for the first year, we would manage their finances for them. Wow. And did that as a service to them and help them in that process. And then we would also, if they didn't have enough leadership yet on the field to have a stewardship team in place, we would give them the names and numbers of people that had rotated off of our stewardship team, and they would volunteer to be counsel for them in financial decisions.
That's cool.
To cultivate how you make those financial decisions as you grow as a fellowship.
Right. Also, how do you get into a building? I mean, we were 5 years into it. We were running like 700 people. Yeah. And then I went to my mentor, Steve Stroop, and I said, Steve, like, when do we start looking for land?
Yeah.
And he goes, you should start looking for land yesterday.
Yeah.
And so then he gave me the practical steps of, like, you need to find a commercial real estate agent. You need to do this. Yeah. And without that, we would still be setting up and breaking down in high school.
Yeah.
And what he just said is so critical. You went to your mentor.
Yeah.
There's just so many things you're not going to know until you experience it. And one of the best things that I ever did is I had some older mentors in my life that I had permission permission to call them, have 5 minutes with them anytime I need them, and ask them that question. What do I do right here? And so much of what I learned was through that.
Yeah, so good. Hey, one final aspect of practical leadership we want to explore is how can church planners keep this motivation for growth and excellence in what they're doing ultimately be subservient to the motivation for Christ and his kingdom? How do we make sure that God's glory is always at the top and excellence and what we're doing is coming underneath that? What are some of the dangers here and how can we avoid them?
For me personally, this is a little bit of a personal pet peeve.
Yeah, come on.
And what I mean by that is when I was planting 20-something years ago, it was very common that everybody put in their values this thing of excellence or pursuing excellence. And I know I don't even know what their opinions of this are, but excellence is not a biblical concept. Diligence is a biblical concept.
That's great.
None of the disciples were excellent.
Yeah.
They weren't.
Yeah.
Look at this table. None of us are excellent.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean we can't be diligent.
Yeah.
That's right.
Excellence is about appearance. Diligence is about effort.
That's really good.
We need to give, and we're called by God to give maximum effort. But we're not called to be excellent. I can't be excellent. Like there's nothing about, and if we cast this vision for excellence, 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 here's what we're saying to most of our people. There's not really a place for you here.
Yeah.
Because not many of them are going to be excellent. And we have to get back to a biblical concept, which is diligence, which is with what God's given you, the very best effort you have, pursue that.
You almost had two parts of your question, and I totally agree with what you're saying in regards to excellence. You also asked this element of growth, and there's something in our ethos right now, or in the church culture, that says that not only is evangelism cringy, but that church growth is kind of cringy. I heard this this quote before. I vote for less grow your church and more grow your disciples. Now, I think that sounds like a great quote on surface level, but that also kind of, to me, sounds like, let's focus on the 99 instead of the 1.
Yep.
Now, that sounds great, but that's just not a part of the mission.
Yeah.
Here's what I think. I think what's more selfish than not growing your church, I think it's more selfish to grow your church. Wait.
You said it backwards.
I said it backwards. It's less selfish to grow your church.
Right.
Do you know why? Because more people, more problems.
That's right.
Yeah.
It is difficult to think of how do I increase my building? How do I increase my ministries? How do I engage people more? I think that's less of a selfish act.
I think that what we've messed up is contrasting those two things.
Yeah,
exactly.
It's not either or.
Yeah,
Exactly.
It's both and. We go after deepening the relationship with our disciples, but at the same time passionately pursuing those that are far from God.
And the reality is, if you're discipling your people, you're going to grow because they're going to be making disciples also.
That's right.
That's right.
And one and the same. And we would always say when it came to excellence in our services, we just wanted things to adorn the gospel. And so if it's not doing that, it's not showing how beautiful Christ is and his gospel is, then it's not working. That's not what we want to do.
Yeah.
Man, you guys have served planters, new church leaders so well in this episode. Thank you so much for your practical wisdom. We're going to flash your email address. I'm just kidding. But seriously, having a mentor, having guys like you that people can reach out to is so important. So Matt, you said that. Like, find a mentor. Yeah. Reach out, ask those questions. Thank you all for joining us for this episode of the New Churches podcast. As always, if you enjoyed it, would you consider liking, sharing, making sure somebody who's in this season of life gets a hold of this episode for their own personal growth. We hope you will join us as we continue our discussion of the 9 essentials of faithful and effective church planters. We'll see you next time.